night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God, and I moan. I meditate, and my spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love ceased forever, or his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we study your word together. It is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, so back to Genesis chapter 9. We will pick off where we left off last week. We are, in reality, almost done with the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is the extent of our study in Genesis, at least at this time. Because when we get in, once we finish chapter 9, and we get into chapter 10 is another genealogy, which there'll be a little bit for us to point out, but not a ton there. Chapter 11, we get the story of the Tower of Babel, which is only 9 verses. And then we get 2 more genealogies that finish up Genesis chapter 11, preparing the way for the beginning of Abraham's story in Genesis chapter 12. So we don't have a lot left before we're finished with our study of Genesis, or at least we're going to take a break from Genesis for a little bit, and then we will move over into the New Testament, and we will spend some time in the Gospel of Mark. Quick reminder of what we talked about last week. We went through the first 7 verses of Genesis chapter 9, where God kind of restarts the creation with Noah and his family, and so he repeats the promises or the command that he gave to Adam and Eve at the very beginning, to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth. We talked about some of the differences in the way that God says it to Noah and his family as opposed to the very beginning, which seems to show us that God is not only starting again the process of creation over again with Noah and his family and the animals from the ark, but God realizes the sinfulness of the human heart, that the human heart is bent towards evil from youth, he says at the end of chapter 8. And so things are going to be a little different as the project restarts because of the sinfulness of the human heart. So we see, for example, the language of the fear and dread of the animal world being towards Noah and his family, towards humanity. So humanity is meant to rule over and to steward the creation, but they're not going to do a perfect job at doing that. And so rather than it being a happy or joyful enterprise to be ruled over by human beings, the creation is going to be filled with fear and dread. We also talked about the extending of the food source for human beings. So at the beginning, God gives all plants to human beings. Here with Noah and his family, that is extended to the animal world. And then we have the discussion of blood that we talked about the last couple of weeks. They are allowed to take the life of an animal for food, but they're not allowed to eat the animal with its life, that is its blood. And that then gets extended to the shedding the blood of human beings, which is of a far greater thing than shedding the blood of an animal. And God talks about that whoever sheds the blood of a human life, their blood will be shed. So it'll kind of be blood for the shedding of a human life, not only for human beings, but also, interestingly enough, for animals. God says he's going to hold animals accountable for shedding the blood of humans. this may be, and this is something that we didn't get into, the blood for blood thing with both humans and animals when they take another human life might be a looking forward. When this is written, it would have actually been a reading back into the law that God gives. So you read through the laws in Leviticus when it comes to human life, that for some human life, and this is kind of the interesting thing, I mentioned this a little bit last week, that probably a whole other discussion about how Israel ranked human life, but the shedding of certain human life, the result of that, according to the law, was the death penalty. So the person who shed the life, their life would be taken. Same thing for an animal. In certain cases, when an animal kills a human being, that animal is also put down. And so it's likely that God's words about life for life of both animals and humans is looking forward to the law that will be given later. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to move on now. Verse 8 of chapter 9. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all earth. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." This is another part of the Noah story that a lot of us are familiar with. Probably heard it as kids. I remember Sunday school, VBS, things like that as a kid. When you talk about the story of Noah, one of the things you talk about is the rainbow in the sky. That is God's promise that he's never going to flood the earth again. And there's a couple of interesting things that maybe you haven't noticed about the way that the text talks about this sign that God gives. First is the covenant or the promise that God makes not to flood the earth. He makes it to Noah and his family. He makes it to their future descendants. Everlasting is the Hebrew term that's used there. So not just Noah and his family, but all the human beings that are going to come after them. God is making this promise not to flood the earth again. But he makes it not just to human beings, but also to the animal world. He says every animal that comes out of the ark, I'm making this promise to. So he's making the promise to the entirety of creation that he will not destroy the creation again with a flood. And another interesting thing is that this promise that God makes is one-sided. So normally when you think of the language of covenant, it's a two-sided thing. So when God makes a covenant with Israel, God's promising to do something and Israel's promising to do something. God is promising to protect them and to bless them and to use them to bless the world. And Israel's response to that is to obey the law. And it's kind of a two-sided thing. If Israel obeys their side of the covenant, God will follow through with his side of the covenant. But the promise that God makes here not to flood is a one-sided promise. Human beings and animals don't have to do anything for God to fill his half of the promise. God is promising outright that he will never flood the earth again. The sign is a bow in the sky, which seems to be a reference to a rainbow, which we don't have to think that this is the first time that there was ever a rainbow. That would, I think, kind of be silly to think. If you understand how a rainbow functions of light refracting through water particles, that anytime you have water in the air, you have the possibility of a rainbow. So what's going on here is not that God creates a rainbow for the first time, but something that we see throughout the Bible is sometimes a promise is made by pointing to something that has always existed or always been there or happens to be there and giving it new meaning. So what God is doing is he's pointing to a rainbow that has been there before, that people are familiar with, and he's giving it a new meaning. He's saying now when you see the rainbow, it's not just a cool thing up in the sky, but it is going to be a reminder for you, and God even says it's going to be a reminder for me of this covenant that I'm making, that I will never flood the earth again. The other interesting thing, I don't think you've ever, I'm not sure you've ever thought of the literal etymology of the idea of rainbow. So rain is obvious. When it rains, water particles, makes sense how we get that part. Bow is normally a word that we use for like an instrument of hunting. You know, you go out with a bow and arrow for hunting or for war or for depending on what period in human history. And in Hebrew, that's the primary meaning of this word bow. So when God says, I've placed a bow up in the sky, this is the only time in the Old Testament it's used to refer to a rainbow. Every other time it is used to refer to like a bow and arrow, a weapon of war and of hunting. And it's actually connected with, we won't dive into this, but it's connected with other flood accounts from other civilizations around Israel that talk about their God placing his weapons of war up in the sky in the form of star constellations. And so we get something similar going on here in Israel's account of the flood. And so the idea of calling it a bow seems to be not merely to refer to a rainbow, but it's kind of a metaphorical saying of God is placing down his weapon. And so God has the weapon or the power, if you will, to flood the earth. And when God makes this promise, and it's a bow that signifies it, it's kind of like God laying down his bow, laying down his weapon, and saying, I'm not going to pick up at least this particular weapon again. I'm not going to pick up my right to flood the earth again. So it's not, the idea of the rainbow is not merely something connected to the rain and the water and the flood, which on the one hand makes sense, but it also has some weapon meaning of God setting down his weapon and his ability to flood the earth and choosing not to do that again. Any questions, comments before we move on to the end of chapter 9, where the story starts to get very crazy? Okay, let's move on. Verse 18, this is where the story begins to get a little weird. Okay, the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three people, the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan. Lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord my God, blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So the conclusion of the flood story is this interesting, I guess you could call it, interaction between Noah and one of his sons, Ham. And it's kind of an anticlimactic conclusion to the story of the flood, because you think about the evil on the earth becomes so bad that God decides he has to do something about it. And it seems the only good person he can find is Noah and his family. And so he chooses to save them. They make it through a year's worth of the flood. They come out of the ark. They make the sacrifice to God. God makes this covenant with him. And it would be great just to end the story there. A nice happy ending for Noah and his family, but it's not how the story ends. The story ends like this. And at first glance, to us as modern readers, this is one of the stories which seems like you could have left this out and it doesn't really change much, right? We can still get the gist of the story of the flood having left this story out. The reason this story here is twofold. The less significant reason, I think, is theologically to show what God had said earlier of the inclination of the human heart. So yes, he's starting over again with Noah and his family, but kind of like the original creation that only is good for 2 chapters and then things go south in chapter 3. The story of Noah and his family is good for a few chapters, but then things quickly go south, and it shows the inclination of the human heart towards evil from youth, which is kind of the whole point of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, is to give us an insight into the human condition. Our need, not merely for God, but for God to do what he said he was going to do after the flood, of doing something to change the human heart. Because the idea of cursing the ground and sending a flood, punishing humanity for everything evil that they do, is not working. Because it quickly leads to God punishes Adam and Eve for eating of the tree, and the next story we get is their children killing each other. God punishes the world through the flood, and the next story we get is Noah and his family, the only good people during that period, falling off the wagon as well. And so, on the one hand, the point of this story is to show us that inclination of the human heart. But for Israel, the primary purpose of this story is to vilify the enemies of Israel and to vindicate Israel's actions in war and conquest. So, Ham is mentioned twice as the father of Canaan, Canaan being one of Ham's sons. And then when Noah gives the curse upon Ham for what he's done, he doesn't curse Ham. He curses Ham's son, Canaan. And so 3 times we get the emphasis that Ham's son is Canaan. Canaan is the one that's cursed because of what Ham has done. Now, where do we know the name Canaan from? Canaan was a land where, what did God do? Canaan was the promised land that God led Israel to through Moses and then Joshua. You remember they go into the land of Canaan, and God tells them to completely destroy the inhabitants of Canaan and to completely kick them out of the land. You think about Israel asking questions like, well, why are the people of Canaan so bad that God wants us to go and kill them all and take their land? Well, the reason is this story. This story for Israel functions as not only an explanation of why God is giving them the land of Canaan, but a vindication of their actions in conquering the land of Canaan. Because the Canaanites are the descendants of Ham, who did this abominable act. We'll talk about what it is that Ham may or may not have done. But that's the primary enemy of Israel. But if you go over to chapter 10, in verse 6, we get the descendants of Ham. So Canaan is one of Ham's sons. Egypt is another. what did Egypt do to the Israelites? Enslaved them. So Israel doesn't like Egypt because they were slaves in Egypt. This story also vilifies Egypt. Egypt was not just our slave holders, but Egypt is also a people who is descendant from Ham. And we don't like Ham because of what Ham does to his father. So we don't have to like the Egyptians. We don't have to like the Canaanites. We can go and conquer and defeat and kill the Canaanites because they're descendant from Ham. In verse 10, the beginning of the kingdom of a descendant of Ham is Babel, which we're about to get a story of the Tower of Babel. So Babel going down the wrong path makes sense to us because these people are descendants of Ham, who is presented as a terrible person in this story. We continue into verse 11. From the land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Where do we know the city of Nineveh from? There's a guy with a fish. Jonah. Jonah goes to Nineveh. Why? And why does Jonah not want to go to Nineveh? Because they're terrible people. Well, why does Jonah think they're terrible people? It may not be that Jonah knows anything about Nineveh. It might be this story. Well, they have to be terrible people because I know that they are descendants of Ham, who was a terrible person. All right, so we continue. Verse 14, at the end of it, from which the Philistines come. The Philistines are the biggest enemy of Israel during their time in the Promised Land. In the land of Canaan, they root out the Canaanites, but not completely. If you remember when we did our series on the book of Judges, Israel absolutely epically failed at rooting out all of the Canaanites from the land. But when they're living in the land of Canaan, their biggest enemy that they're fighting all the time is the Philistines. You might remember the Philistines. There was a famous giant that a young boy killed. That giant's name was David and Goliath. Yes, a battle against the Philistines. Why do we not like the Philistines? Well, because, again, the Philistines are descendants of Ham. We go down to verses 16 and 17. Canaan became this is 15. Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, are all people that are named all the time in the Old Testament when Israel is going to battle against someone. So you may have noticed in study, Bible reading, whatever, there's times where in the Old Testament the enemies of Israel will be listed, and there's all these ites names, the Hivites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, are all kind of listed here. These are the enemies of Israel that they're constantly fighting against. Why are they fighting against these people? Why do they want to destroy these people? Because they're descendants of Ham. And these people were living in the area of Canaan, which is the land that God promises to Israel. So, the primary reason we have this story is to vilify the enemies of Israel, particularly the people living in the Promised Land, to build up Israel's confidence in what they are doing, to verify that they are doing the right thing in wanting to kill and destroy and run out these people from the land of Canaan. It also explains why they have such a troubling time with certain groups of people like the Egyptians. It explains the evil people in the story of Noah being the Ninevites. That is the primary purpose of this story. So while it's kind of anticlimactic for the story of Noah, for the people of Israel, it would have been very important because it explains why they don't like the people that they don't like. All right, with that, we can move on to the weird part of the story of what happens between Ham and Noah. So Noah plants a vineyard, which makes sense. He is identified as a man of the soil. So he plants a vineyard, he grows some grapes, he makes some wine, he drinks that wine, and he becomes drunk off the wine and passes out naked in his tent. Now, a couple things about Noah planting this vineyard is it connects us back to Genesis chapter 2. Remember Genesis chapter 2, the man, Adam, is created to work the ground, to care for the garden. And so when God restarts the creation with Noah, we see man going back to the job that God created and designed them for, to work the ground, to care for the creation. So it makes sense that Noah, not only as a man of the soil, but as a human being in this restarted creation, is going to work the ground. That's what we would expect. That's what should happen. So he plants this vineyard as he should. He, as I said, he makes some wine, he drinks it, and becomes drunk. Now, the interesting thing is that the text never identifies whether it is a good or bad thing for Noah to plant the vineyard, or to get drunk on the wine, or to lay naked in his tent. It's just kind of said, and then we move on to Ham, who becomes the villain of the story. Again, probably because what Israel is concerned about is not so much the actions of Noah, but the actions of Ham in order to vilify their enemies. And so what Noah does is kind of just left there ambiguously. We're left to wonder, well, was it a good or a bad thing, or just a neutral thing for Noah to plant the vineyard and to get drunk on the wine and to lay naked in his tent? Something interesting, at least about the nakedness, is this also takes us back to Genesis 1 through 3, because if you remember at the beginning, we're told that Adam and Eve are naked and not ashamed. The shame comes after the fall, where they realize that they were naked and become ashamed. So Noah being naked in his tent at the beginning wouldn't have been something to be shameful of. But now, after the fall, there's a certain amount of shame that comes with that. But nevertheless, Noah is in his tent. He's by himself. He's not running around in public without any clothes on or something like that. So there's not much that can be said negatively of Noah. Perhaps the getting drunk part, though the text doesn't actually say that. But in general, Noah's actions are not presented in the story as a negative thing. It is Ham's actions. It's also interesting that the original problem with the creation in Genesis 3 has to do with a fruit from the earth. And when God restarts with Noah, the problem is also a fruit of the earth. And so there's a lot of connections between what happens here with Noah and his sons and the story of Adam and Eve. You could even extend that, and there's tension that is created between the brothers. So Ham commits this act towards his father. The other two brothers reject what Ham does and try and go and cover their father. So you have some brotherly rivalry. That takes us back to Adam and Eve as well. So after the problem with the fruit in Genesis 3, we're left to problem where the next story is problem among brothers in Genesis chapter 4. It's kind of the same thing here. You have a problem with the fruit of the ground that leads to what Ham does, and then that then leads to the next part of the story of some conflict between brothers. So what happens here with Noah and his family is kind of a rehashing of what happens with Adam and Eve and their family, which again goes to show us the inclination of the human heart. And so it's just kind of a cycle. What happens with Adam and Eve in the original creation happens with Noah and his family when God restarts the creation. When Noah gets drunk and passes out naked in his tent, we are told that Ham sees his father's nakedness. Now, a couple of things to say here about the language. So the word naked, when Noah gets naked, it comes from the word for bare, which makes sense to us, right? Noah's bare, he's not wearing any clothes. In the Old Testament, it does not necessarily have a negative connotation. So for example, Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed. So it doesn't have to have a negative connotation. But it is most often used in the Old Testament to refer to bearing or showing one's private parts. So it has a negative connotation most often in the Old Testament. And so when a Hebrew reader is reading this, their first thought is negative. The nakedness of Noah is a problem, though it doesn't always have to be. But generally, there's a negative connotation. Also, throughout the Old Testament, not to get too explicit, but it's in the Bible, to expose one's private parts or to see them in many times is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. So it opens up the possibility that what happens here is not merely seeing, but in Hebrew, a lot of the times to see a person's nakedness is to have some kind of sexual intercourse with it. Now, here's the thing. I refer back, if y'all were here for our study on the book of Ruth, we talked about when Ruth goes down to the threshing floor at night with Boaz. We're told that Ruth uncovers Boaz's feet. And I mentioned that feet in Hebrew is a euphemism for male private parts. And I mentioned that sometimes feet means feet. And sometimes feet doesn't mean feet. And so you're left in the context to decide for yourself what it means for Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet. And it's the same thing in this story. So sometimes to see a person's nakedness means just to see a person who has no clothes on. Sometimes that's what it means. That's not normally what it means, but it can mean that. Sometimes to see is just to see. But sometimes to see is also to have sex with the person that you are seeing. And the story leaves that open for interpretation for us, to decide for ourselves, does see mean just to see, or is see being used as a euphemism to say that there is something more that is going on here between Ham and his father Noah? Real quickly, I'm going to give a couple of arguments on both sides of that interpretation. On the side to view seeing just as seeing might be suggested by what the other brothers do, right? The other brothers get a blanket between them and they walk backwards into the tent to cover their father's nakedness so that they don't see. That seems to suggest the possibility that maybe the problem was just seeing, just looking upon. However, the curse on Ham, that his son and all of his descendants for eternity will be cursed because of what Ham does, suggests that there's something more than just seeing. I don't know if you've ever read this story before and wondered, well, why is every descendant of Cain cursed for all of eternity for maybe accidentally walking into his father's tent and just seeing his father passed out, drunk, with no clothes on? Well, maybe the reason that the punishment is so harsh is because seeing is being used as a euphemism here. The other thing that I think is most interesting is if you go to Leviticus chapters 18 and 19, and I'm going to go over there real quick because I'm going to read a little bit of this for you. In Leviticus 18 and 19, we get the part of, 18 and 20, we get the part of the law that deals with sexual relations. So how are Israel's sexual relations governed? What are they allowed to do, and what are they not allowed to do? And here's what's interesting. In Leviticus 18, it opens up like this. The Lord is speaking to Moses, and he says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes." What's interesting is when God gives instructions about the sexual relations of Israel, he gives them in the context of saying your sexual relations should not look like Egypt and Canaan. Which, interestingly enough, they would have realized, hey, these are descendants of Ham, who perhaps did his own prohibited sexual action. So for Israel, it would make sense of, we don't want to engage in sex in the way that Egypt and Canaan did because of where they're descended from. They're descended from Ham, who might for Israel have been seen as kind of the chief sinner in this arena. Now, This is where, to me, it gets interesting. Verse 6, none of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. And then it goes your sister and your father's daughter and your mother's daughter, and it kind of goes through. The whole point is you do not uncover the nakedness of family members. Israel's not to do that, which seems to suggest that Egypt and Canaan were doing that. Now here, it's obvious, I think, that to uncover one's nakedness is being used as a euphemism of something else, of not engaging in sexual relations with family members like Egypt and Canaan did. And it's just interesting to me that in the law you have this prohibition, don't do this, because Egypt and Canaan do it, who are both descendants of Ham, that we're wondering, did Ham may have done the very thing that Israel is prohibited of doing, which seems to suggest to me that what Ham does is more than just seeing, because it becomes for Israel the prohibition not to be like Ham, which is not to be like the descendants of Ham, not to be like these other nations who continue to do the evil act that Ham is doing. Israel is instructed, you don't do that. You live differently. You don't engage in these actions. And you could go and read in Exodus chapter 20 as well. It's the same thing. It begins with, don't be like Egypt, don't be like Canaan, and then it moves into how Israel is to engage in sexual relations. After all of this happens, Noah wakes up, though, and he gives that curse. Again, I mentioned it's not on Ham, it's on his son, Canaan, because Israel's trying to vilify the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. He gives this curse to Ham. This is interesting to me. It's more of a fun fact for the rest of you. But this is the first time in the Noah story that Noah talks. You read the rest of it, Noah doesn't say anything. God speaks, Noah does. This is the first time and only time that Noah actually speaks. And it's to curse one of his sons, to bless his other two sons, and to hope that the descendants of Ham become slaves of his other children. Anyway, that concludes chapter 9. I know there's a lot there. It's a very weird story. It's probably not what you expected to talk about in Bible class this morning, but nevertheless, here it is. We have a couple of minutes. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns about this story? I've got a book in my office, and I've done a series on weird stories of the Bible, and this is one of them. One of the weirder stories of the Bible. It's one of the reasons that I've said this before, that it's a little ironic that we love to teach our kids Old Testament Bible stories, because there is so much that's not kid-friendly in the Old Testament. And normally we cut out parts of the story. So like we love the story of Noah, but we don't get into the end of the Noah story. We just kind of, we stop with the rainbow in the sky. That's enough for us, and then we leave it there. Or like the story of David and Goliath we love, but we typically leave out the part where David goes and gets Goliath's sword and cuts off his head, and the head's kind of used in the victory march type thing. We leave that part out of the story of David. Anyways, this isn't just one of the weird stories. It's one of the ones that, I don't know, to me is a little ironic that we love the story of Noah, but maybe not all the story of Noah.
Yeah, I just find it interesting because people, we hear this little section of 1,000 years of their life, so what, actually went on that leads up to these stories is,
Yeah, and that's something that I think is important, and I tell people that, when you read the Old Testament, we can't read it like we're just reading a history textbook that you pull off the wall, because these stories are written by Israelites for Israelites. So like, why do we skip all these generations between Noah and Abraham? Well, because for Israel, they don't care. Abraham is their father, and they care about how do we get from the original creation to Abraham, which is kind of what these stories are. And why do we get this anticlimactic ending of the story of Noah? Well, because for Israel it means something, because it vilifies their enemies. And so the way that these stories are told and how we get from one point to another, to me is very interesting when we think about it in the context in which it was written, that Israel is trying to understand themselves and where they fit into the world. And that's the point of these stories. And so when we're looking at them, asking, well, what does this mean for Israel? Why did they write it down? Because it wasn't cheap or easy to write it down. This is the last thing that I'll say. This isn't about the Old Testament, it's about the New Testament, but it makes the point of not easy to write down. I read an article yesterday of a scholar who has written several books on first century letter writing. So how did letter writing function in the first century so that we better understand the letters of Paul? And he did an estimate about how much it would cost, a conservative estimate, so this is kind of a lowball figure, of what it would cost in today's money to have written one of Paul's letters. And the letter to the Romans in today's value would have cost about $2,500 to write in today's currency, and that's so probably somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 just to write one letter, which makes the point. You didn't just write anything down; it had to be pretty important. And the further you go back, the more difficult and expensive it was to write things down. So, with stories like this, as I said, thinking about why would Israel write and preserve for thousands of years these stories, and how do they fit into their view of the world and themselves?
It's
God.
been preserved for our schoolmaster, so that we would know what he expected of the world from the beginning to the end.
And give us an insight into our human condition,
Right.
of our own fallenness, right? Okay, we will pick up there next week. The rest of Genesis will go by rather quickly because a lot of it is just a list of names that we won't spend much time on. We'll spend a little bit of time on the Tower of Babel, but a very short story in and of